Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is Chase Rend, and I'm the Executive Director here at the National Building Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the museum for tonight's very special program. Now, as many of you know, the National Building Museum is America's foremost institution dedicated to educating the public about the world that we build for ourselves. Our exhibitions and our educational programs showcase achievements in architecture, urban planning, engineering, construction, and design. And I would like to draw your attention to two other programs that may interest you. Tomorrow morning, between 10 and 11, landscape architect Walter Hood and principals of Shop Architects from New York, who are both recipients of this year's National Design Awards from the Smithsonian's Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum, they'll be here to discuss ways to use design to engage your neighborhood. And then next Tuesday at 7 p.m., we will present the top 3 winners of the Green Community International Student Competition, which is now on view in our center court right here. And that will be followed by a lecture by the lead juror, Ivan Harbour. And for more information on both of those programs, you can just check on our website, mbm.org. And I do hope you'll come back and visit us for those. Now, looking around, you may have noticed that tonight's audience is heavily skewed toward a younger crowd. And this is because we are welcoming some 200 student delegates from across North America to the American Institute of Architecture Students' 25th Annual Grassroots Leadership Conference. And tonight's event, tonight's lecture, is a part of that conference. Congratulations to the AIAS for this milestone, the silver anniversary. This is our 6th collaboration with the AIAS in as many years, and I do want to thank their executive director, Michael Gary, for his continuing partnership. Thank you, Michael. Each year at this conference, a new slate of AIAS officers is elected, and at this time, we'd like to recognize the 2 new officers just elected this afternoon. Please join me in congratulating the new AIAS President, Janine Chastain, and Vice President Brett Roth. Please stand to be recognized. Congratulations. Are you there? There you are. Thank you. Congratulations. I'd also like to extend our best wishes to the immediate past President, J.W. Blanchard, and Vice President Deanna Moore. Please stand to be recognized as well. Are you there? Deanna, congratulations. The AIAS is just a terrific organization, and we really enjoy partnering with you. Tonight's program is part of the museum's ongoing Spotlight on Design lecture series. This series features designers of distinction from around the world. For several years, Spotlight on Design has been generously sponsored by Lafarge, the world leader in construction materials. We are very appreciative of Lafarge's generous support, and coincidentally, Lafarge is also a multi-year supporter of the AIAS. For many years, Lafarge has underwritten the AIAS's leadership development programs, including the Grassroots Conference. We also receive additional support of this series from the American Institute of Architects, and we are equally grateful for their support. To say a few words about their organizations, please welcome Chris McEntee, Executive Vice President and CEO of the AIA, who will be followed by Kevin Kale, Lafarge Director for Sustainability and Commercial Innovation. Chris?
Thank you, Chase. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the American Institute of Architects, welcome. It's wonderful that you're able to include this lecture as part of your grassroots leadership program. I think that, like AIAS has found that the Building Museum and Lafarge are really wonderful partners in helping to advance the education and the development of architectural students and architects both here in DC and around the country. Let me add my congratulations on your silver anniversary. It's a very exciting time for AIAS, and we are delighted as AIA to be able to give continued support to the architectural students. We are delighted to be part of the Spotlight on Design series and to have Tom Kundig here, whose firm won the Firm Award and was here actually not too long ago receiving that award in Washington, D.C., and I know that you're in for a special treat with him. And Lafarge, we thank you. I also want to let you know that AIA is expanding its relationship with the Building Museum, and we're hoping and planning to do a joint exhibit this fall where some of the exhibit will be here and some will actually be at AIA's headquarters. And so look forward to announcing that and letting you all know about that. So I hope you enjoy this evening. I know you're in for a special treat with Tom Kundig being here. And again, welcome and congratulations on your 25th anniversary. Thank you, Chase.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Building Museum. Since 2001, Lafarge has worked with the National Building Museum as the corporate sponsor of the Spotlight on Design. We've welcomed more than 30,000 guests and featured many acclaimed architects and designers from around the world. Lafarge's partnership with the National Building Museum is one step in our ongoing commitment to work with and learn from architects in our community. We hope that together we can find innovative and sustainable solutions for the construction industry and the general public, while also providing architects with the products they need for today's ambitious projects. Lafarge is the world leader in building materials with top-ranking positions in all of our businesses: cement, concrete, aggregates, and gypsum. But beyond that, we're proud of the fact that we're one of 2 companies in the construction materials sector to be listed in the 2009 100 Global Most Sustainable Corporations in the World. This evening, Lafarge would like to welcome Tom Kundig and to the National Building Museum. We would like to thank the National Building Museum for all of their work in support of Spotlight on Design, and thanks to all of you in the audience for being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you both for your partnership and your support of the museum. And now, on for the show. It is my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker. Tom Kundig is a principal with the Seattle-based architecture firm Olson, Sundberg, Kundig, Allen, which, as Chris noted, was awarded the AIA's 2009 Architecture Firm Award. An accomplished and recognized architect in his own right, Tom was named an Emerging Voice by the Architectural League in 2004, received an Academy Award for Architecture in 2007, and was the recipient of the 2008 National Design Award in Architecture Design, awarded by the Smithsonian's Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum. Tom's designs are characterized by a raw kinetic construction that explores new forms of engagement with site and landscape. His work frames that construction through unique building-size machines. A perfect example of this is seen in Rolling Huts, which was named a record house by Architectural Record magazine in 2008. His work is featured in magazines and books. In 2006, Princeton Architectural Press released Tom Kundig Houses, a few copies of which just happened to be available right across the way in the museum shop, coincidentally. Tom's Mission Hill Winery in British Columbia was featured in the museum's exhibition Liquid Stone, New Architecture in Concrete, and appeared in the accompanying book of the same name. And I can attest to the quality of the Mission Hills wine, since Tom persuaded them to supply the adult beverages for a reception here a few years ago. It was terrific. And on a further personal note, I should confess that I got to know Tom years ago when I was living in Seattle, and have long admired the quality of his work, his commitment to design excellence, and his commitment to community service. For the record, Tom's undergraduate and graduate architecture degrees are from the University of Washington in Seattle. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about such fascinatingly named projects as Chicken Point Cabin and Hot Rod House. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tom Kundig.
Let's make sure everything, is this on? Ooh, yep, it's on. Thanks. Thank you for tonight. I think we have about an hour and a half or so. I like to go quickly through my slides, so be prepared. for that, and I'd like to leave like a half an hour or so for questions. I actually like responding to questions is actually more than I like lecturing. So I'm going to try to keep the pace up on the lecture. First thing to mention, and I should also warn some of the architects in the audience that this is more of a lecture geared to the students and young intern architects. We are not, as a group, our firm is not an academic firm. We're practitioners, and we actually have spent our time in the practice of architecture. The academic world is a terrific world. It's a great place to be, but the four of us, and now we just made two new partners, Alan Maskin and Kirsten Murray, and they are also practitioners. We grew up with the business. I personally grew up with the business. My dad is an architect. I actually left home not wanting to be an architect because he was an architect. So I actually went to the University of Washington to study physics. I'm going to tell a little bit about my story because for students, I think it's super important to understand that what you do as architects ultimately is what you're doing right now and probably what you did as a childhood. I'm 54 years old. I can kind of look back on my history and understand that so much of what I did, not wanting to be an architect, doing other things that were really important to me, somehow inform all of the stuff that hopefully you're going to recognize has had an effect on the work I do. I hope that kind of makes sense, and save some of your questions if you do have some questions about anything that I'm going to talk about tonight. Photograph here is of the office in our skylight that opens up to the sky. It's important to note that architecture is not a single person effort. It's the whole architect as a single person doing all of this is a myth, and it always has been a myth. Once you are in the business of architecture and the sort of the craft of the architecture, you're going to realize the client is an awfully important part of making that building. You won't exist without a client. And all of these projects have huge influence by the client on their work. And personally, I actually enjoy that part as much as anything in the work. And that's hopefully you'll sort of recognize that each of these buildings has their own sort of little personality, has a lot to do with the client. And hopefully my DNA, their DNA, and then also craftspeople that are actually building these things. We don't build these projects anymore. That happened back, who knows, 200 years ago, where there was that bifurcation where the craftsmen went off to one side of the ring and the architects went off to the other side of the ring. And now we've been trying to put those two together. There are some terrific firms out there that are trying to bring that back together. And I'll talk a little bit about how you, even as architects in the practice of architecture, can try to make that bridge back to the craftsperson. Because a craftsperson is actually the person that's building this building. And the better relationship you have with them, the better your building will be in the end. And the craftsperson is looking that you not only respect what they do, but you also understand what they do. And until you actually do that work and understand that their job is actually as difficult as your job, that respect won't really happen. And I urge you to think about that as you're going through your career. Again, in our firm, we're old-fashioned in a sense that we expect architects to do everything from the early conceptual scribbles, the drawings that are sort of ideas. We ask everybody to participate in that. Certainly the partner in charge, the principal in charge, ultimately makes the final decision and maybe does and scribbles along with everybody else. We follow the project all the way through, and we expect people that we hire that have gone through design development, construction documents, and in particular construction administration, because construction of a project is so important for the work that we do. We're considered sort of more craft-based as a firm rather than idea-based, and I think that has a lot to do with our sort of our interest in the buildings from soup to nuts, that we're actually building something that's going to be around for 200 years and outlives us. You know, it will outlive everybody in this room, and that's just super exciting and a privilege to actually be involved in. So I want to make it clear that as we go through all of these projects, I'm up here talking about them, but really what I'm doing is I'm talking about a whole bunch of people that are involved in the project, and I can't name all those people that were involved in the project. I said earlier I was 54 years old, and when you turn 50, you all of a sudden begin to realize how important things are in your past. And in particular, I think my youth has a lot to do with the architecture that I've been involved in. And I was kind of raised in eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and then spent a lot of time in southeast British Columbia. That is, frankly, the land of the big landscape. That has a lot to do with how I approach architecture. Everybody else has different sort of backgrounds, and everybody else has different places to sort of pull their inspiration from. That happens to be one that's super important to me. I'm going to back up just a sec here. I forgot to mention that now I live over here in the Seattle area. This is the wet side, this is the dry side. We have all 7 ecozones. We go from a very deserty climate to obviously glaciated mountains, and that's also very important. Huge influence on me as a kid, and an influence on the office too. Right now, this is kind of the country where I live. This is in the San Juan Islands. You can see the volcanic mountain in the back. That's Mount Baker, and then the forested sort of low hills. It's typically is relatively gray, relatively dark during the winter. Right now, we have a beautiful summer. We typically have beautiful summers, but it's sort of a mushy season. I actually grew up on the other side of the mountains. It's a very 4 distinct season. Big sky, big mixed forests, basically river bottom, valleys, and then, of course, mountaintops that I spent a lot of time in. The Palouse is a huge influence on me. Very rich agricultural country. Again, big sky, big lonesome, big sort of quiet areas, and true 4 seasons. The extraction industry is hugely important to me as a kid. I was raised in the 60s and the 70s, lumber, farming, mining. Enormous industries that are almost all gone except for some of the farming. But mining and lumber was certainly a big part of me. And I, as a kid, was always intrigued by a lot of the buildings that were built during those times. The way our forebears basically harnessed nature to make something out of nature was hugely fascinating to me. And I think that's where the physics sort of invention, gizmo sort of mechanical thing comes from. But I saw a lot of beauty in what some people thought was actually ugly. And what I thought was beautiful was the way people thought about how to assemble these sort of parts and pieces of buildings. Rick Joy and I, about 3 or 4 years ago, were talking about our lost years and how important those lost years were to our profession. Rick was a drummer for a number of years and into jazz in particular and music, and he knows how important that is to his architecture. I was climbing mountains in my 20s and my 30s. It was a period of time in architecture where postmodernism sort of reigned. It was a bizarre time for me, and I felt like I didn't really fit into that culture. And I looked on those years for years as sort of wasted time to what I'm doing right now. But in fact, it was probably one of the most important times because I'd spent a lot of time in the mountains, and I began to sort of understand how I like to operate. Mountain climbing is a lot like music, it's poetry, it's anything that you're interested in. You can glean something and learn something from what you're doing to learn how to do architecture. Mountain climbing is all about, not about getting to the top, it's about how elegantly, how cleanly, efficiently, and lightly you can get to the top. So it's all about solving problems as you go, much like architecture. And the way you solve those problems and the things that you're involved in and how you sort of react to those things, hugely important to your work. Again, like music. If you're into music, if you're into drums, like Rick Joy is, he's clearly an architect at the top of his game, one of the best architects in the country. It's really, for him, 2 huge influences. The landscape he ultimately moved to, which was Arizona, and also his music. I was also lucky because I was raised by an architect, and I was actually influenced by a lot of the architecture of my dad's friends. This is a cabin in 300 square feet, does more architecture, I think, than even the stuff that I've been doing more recently. I've never been able to reach it at this level. I could talk about this little cabin forever, but it's literally, it says everything about our architecture, and it's done in 300 square feet. Architecture does not have to be big. Architecture does not have to be big to move people or have huge influence on people. I was also lucky because I grew up around artists. This is not an artist I grew up with, but Jean Tinguely's work in Switzerland had, again, huge influence. He was able to look at the mechanics of things, and make us laugh and make us sort of wink and nod about the beauty of what some people would think was not beautiful. I was lucky to work with a sculptor who actually fabricated his own ideas. So in the true sense of the master builder, this was a person that would take ideas, fabricate them himself and use the materials and the nature of those materials and sort of work his ideas out. And that's, again, really important in the stuff that I do, is use the nature of the materials that actually inform the idea from the very beginning. So if you're using concrete, you're using the idea of concrete or how concrete works to actually inform your scribbles at the beginning of the project. But you have to sort of understand how those materials work before you can make some of those decisions. Harold was also the one that sort of broke through that elitist sort of attitude in the 60s that artists had about people out there like craftspeople that were making things. And he once said to me in 1969, if you want to see real art, if you want to see people that are really making a difference in other people's lives, if you want to see somebody taking a commodity and making something interesting out of it, look at hot rods. He says the craft is incredible, the ideas are incredible, they are art in themselves. And I always remember that because, again, it isn't just because you've got a license or you've got a degree. There's a lot of people out there doing sort of wonderful things that you can learn from for your architecture. Another thing, this is not the strongest project I ever worked on. Doesn't have all the best stuff in it, but it's my wife it's our house. Always recommend this to all architects. This is, not, again, not terribly conceptually strong, but what we've been doing is we call it hot rod house because it is sort of like a hot rod. It's basically taking something and sort of tweaking it and learning things from it. Obviously, we don't have the money to really be able to do what some of my clients ask me to do. So we would take our money and pool it into things that we wanted to experiment with. One of the things being a stair that basically was taking the idea that sort of works its way through the house and becomes a bridge based on the idea of origami, where you can take a flat piece of steel that's sort of wobbly in its 2 dimensions, and then turn it into a three-dimensional box and make a sculpture out of it. So with limited funds, make a sculpture, make something that we could walk up and down and always experience every day. Absolutely recommend this for any student in the audience. Learn how tough it is to make some of this stuff, and learn actually some of the possibilities, because that's also important too. Sometimes people will say, you can't do that. Well, if you've done it and you understand it, then you can say, well, no, I think you can do that, and then you can push envelopes on it. Invented windows. I always say to people, the architects out here, I always say, these windows, I always thought it would be cool to take steel and literally glue the windows into the steel. If I did that to a client, I'd be sued. As far as I know, you can't sue yourself. So I went ahead and experimented with this idea. All these windows that you see in the house, this is the moment frame of the house. That window is literally glued into the moment frame. It faces south and west in Seattle. Those are 80 mile an hour high winds, driven rain, works fine. Can't do it for a client. But you can do it for yourself. Again, you can experiment on your own house. You can take things, try out things. What happens when bronze gets bent? What's the kind of shape that happens? Also experimented, obviously, with a gizmo in the house. The idea of taking a television and moving it to the lower floor so you only had to buy one television. Tried to convince my wife that was a cost-saving strategy. Really wasn't. But the whole idea of sort of how you sort of can move something from the upstairs downstairs so it doesn't sort of clutter, and you can sort of experiment with the idea of physics and how things kind of come together. This is a really important part. Everybody comes to me and says, you do great work because you get to work with great clients. I have bad clients just like anybody else does, but there's always one chance in your career where you're going to have a great client. This was my great client. I was 41 years old. I graduated in I think I was 22 or 23. It took me that many years to find a great client. I think firmly there is an apprenticeship program in architecture. It takes about 10 years to 15 years to really get to know what you're doing. When you leave, your professors did the best possible thing they could do, which was to teach you something that's impossible to teach, which is architecture. And architecture that comes from the heart, you have to take all that history, you have to take all that academic work, and you have to begin to sort of understand how it works. I was 40 years old when I finally met a client where all of this stuff kind of came together and conspired to work. Important thing is, you want to make sure it all intersects at the same time, because everybody gets a good client, but you don't want that client to come too soon, because you're going to swing, you're going to miss, or you're going to just barely get it over the fence. You really want to be ready for it. Carol Bobo, hired me to do this house. She was an artist. She was a free-thinking person, a risk taker like I am. She was wonderful to work with, very difficult to work with, not easy to work with, very difficult to work with, but always the process worked out to something that both of us couldn't have done by ourselves, but better than both of us could have done. Very simple party. You can see it's just basically the big room, her studio, in the middle of the house, wrapped by her sort of bedrooms and offices, and had a big roof on top that would basically reflect the light back down into the room. And these are just some photographs of this. Is about 10 years old, 12 years old, something like that. Shifted access to the entry of the house because it's photography work and the privacy that she needs, so that you aren't really invited into this house, but once you're there at the house, you've got enough courage to come to the front door, 14-foot tall front door, the lantern to the house. You come and turn the corner. There's her studio. She's an artist that wants to live in her studio. Not all our, we'll talk about another project where the person actually wants to move to their studio. So this is where you sort of get those personalities into the project. So the big room, basically, she's morphed it over time. Martin Moeller was asking me today, do you mind if people change the interiors of your building? I love it. Actually, I think it's more interesting than if everything was just sort of neat and tidy and perfect. I actually like the idea that things age, change, and people change those things. And sometimes they'll even change the furniture. That's fine with me. It may not be what I like, but I just think it's sort of fascinating to watch. Some interior shots of the big room, some of her artwork that occasionally will be focused on that back wall, that working wall. This is back from the pool side, so you can get the party really clearly. You know, the big glass box in the middle, that's basically a great big room that can be modified for her photography work with all sorts of curtains and shades and all, like a great big aperture basically on a camera. Some of the detail in the house, really was happy to, oops, excuse me, I keep pressing this wrong button. You know, some of the detail, and again, you'll get indulged sometimes with clients that you know, you'll pick a couple of, basically you do an inexpensive house on the large picture, but then you save some money for the really sweet parts that you can really focus on. Obviously, the gate, the kitchen dining and sort of buffet, concrete doors on bronze cast wheels. Worked with David Galassa and Janice Viekman on this project. Terrific collaborators on this. Terrific times around the table talking about things. This is one of my favorite parts of the project. I drew some commodity light bulbs up here to sort of bounce light off of the ceiling. Carol's husband at the time said, "Why don't you guys do something custom?" It was wonderful. We got into English wheel work. Then English wheels are fairly common, but back when we were working on this, no one really knew what an English wheel was. It's the way auto workers would make the fenders. It's just basically a couple wheels skewed against each other, and it's a real skill, frankly. David found one in a junkyard and began making these shapes. These are down on the floor, and then it's sort of a custom, sort of hot-rodded part of the house that basically is shielding the light that bounces off the ceiling above. We made a custom fireplace. David, again, is a metal worker, so it was easy to work with the craftsmen in the room so we could talk about the possibilities and the limitations of what we were trying to do. This fireplace was so appalling to the building official that he walked into the room, turned around, and said, "I think that's an appliance, and I don't have to look at it." But it works, and it's fine. Sketches, this is what I do. You're going to have to figure this out for yourself. How are you going to communicate your ideas quickly, not with a computer or a laptop on the job site? How do you sort of modify things when you're on the job site? You have to have a quick sketch. I personally like the hand sketches that work. These are really important sketches, and ultimately that's the only way you really get that kind of stuff, working with the craftspeople. Furniture. Again, you have to be there I think you have to be there during the construction of these buildings because wonderful things happen, the way they fit in, wonderful ideas happen during the building of this is a classic. Did this sort of piece of furniture here, just real smooth, clean lines. Discovered a problem in the project, put a little hole in the cabinet, and the cabinet's even better. So those are those sort of anomalies that begin to sort of creep up and actually make the project, I think, more interesting. It's a more personal, intimate kind of part of the story. This is a project. It's also in the book, but so I'll quickly kind of go through. This is a director, a film director that wants to leave his house to work. That's why it's called The Brain. He says he wants to get into his brain when he works. So basically, it's a very simple idea. It's a box with big windows, filtered light through the trees, the Pacific Northwest trees, filtered light through some big curtains, theater curtains, and some scrim curtains for the interior of the space. Basically a place for him to just sort of think, do, work, edit, and put together his art. You know, basically the art just because a big box to make art. This is also did a little work on the origami thing, the sort of bent steel. That loft is all out of half-inch steel, just basically bent up. There's no structure in the project. Some of the detailing, again, that comes up during the work. This is obviously something I had drawn. This is something we discovered, the through-bolt system in the concrete. We discovered those were, we thought, well, they're holes. Maybe we should fill them up with something. And we decided it should be glass marbles, like lenses. So during the day and the sun is setting, we get this great light effect in it. Wouldn't have happened unless we were on the site looking at the project. Big project for me, Mission Hill Winery. This is the one Chase was mentioning that was in the book, Liquid Stone. Once in a lifetime opportunity for me. Lesson learned here is that the only way I got this project, because no one would take me seriously for a project of this scale, it's about 250,000 square feet. The lesson learned here was that I was nice to this guy's girlfriend like 5 years before she hooked up with this guy. And she remembered me and said, well, that guy was kind of a nice guy. Why don't you talk to him? That was my only connection to this project. It became this sort of like project. So be nice, be helpful. He bought a place that was bankrupt, basically. It was a winery that was bankrupt. The wine was so bad they tried beer. And the beer was so bad that they actually reverted to putting money in the cases as they were going through the bottling line. So you didn't know if you had $2 or 50 cents in the case when you bought the case. It was a gimmick. My sketches, thinking sketches, presentation sketches, and then ultimately it gets built. It's built. These are the craftspeople. These guys built this exquisite winery. All they had done before this was water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, and highways. They didn't trust us at all. They thought we were just a bunch of architects with fancy shoes and big words, and it turned out to be very close friends, terrific people. Then after a while, they realized that we were really pretty serious about what we did, and they did so much to make this project better because of the kind of commitment they made into this project. They took these big barrel vaults and they actually scribed them. You know, we didn't know if you'd never really ask somebody to scribe in, board form concrete into a rough, blasted out rock wall like that. They were willing to do it. We talked about because they were concrete people, these guys grew up in concrete since they were like 7 years old. They knew concrete as well as anybody in the world. We had them do precast, we had them do cast in place. We were telling the story of concrete through the building from the sort of, because we were trying to tell the story of wine, traditional wine to the current place of wine. So everything in the building is built like great big cookies, great big sort of parts and pieces sort of assembled. And it's all about concrete. And basically it's trying to crescendo at that sort of center point at the tower. And the tower is kind of the center point of the intersection of the cellar down below. And again, this is one of my favorite places. It's almost it's not really a sacred space, but it kind of feels like a sacred space because of the volume, the quietness, and the sort of how concrete feels when it's underground and sort of wrapping you. You can see the tower is actually our daylighting from above too. The tower is right above here. You can see that blue light that's coming down. That's intentional to sort of build up the daylighting at one corner of the winery. So when people come from above down into the cellar, their eyes slowly adjust as they enter into the wine. And so there's two long barrel vaults where some of the winery or some of the barrels are kept. Just some of the sneak daylighting that comes down into that ground, and then looking back down into the lowest part of the site and the tallest part. Very exciting project for me. This is our office. Come visit us when you can. We're in downtown Seattle. Chase knows this place well. Very simple. Obviously limited budget here also. How do you take a limited budget and make something out of it? And I still think that you can always make something cool out of even a limited budget. Basically, make everything as sort of efficient and clean as possible, and then save your money for the one move that you can do. Our indulgence was this skylight. I always wanted to experiment with the idea of water pressure from your kitchen sink, basically, moving big, heavy things. So my partners indulged me. They said, okay, give it a try. I worked with the engineer I worked with a lot I was really lucky to meet Phil. We'll talk about him a little bit further. And we decided, let's see if we can make a device that opens up using city water pressure, ventilates, daylights, does an art piece. It's R&D for us. And then ultimately, the water that comes out of these pistons is our irrigation system for our rooftop garden. It does not move this fast. That's a guarantee. But it basically, from this little valve, we basically just fill up this thing, and it works. It's 3.5 tons of glass and steel. It comes through this little intersecting circle valve. This is from the 1890s in steam engine technology. Some engineer back then came together with this idea that you can't, because in steam, obviously, you've got to close a valve before you open a valve. It's a really sweet detail. Comes out of basically a pattern book of engineering ideas. And you can see the way it opens, and then this is the art piece that happens on center at the entry. When the sun goes through the sky, especially in the summer, we get these terrific patterns, and it basically becomes a sort of timepiece in the office. And yeah, you can think, well, is that interesting? Well, actually, the more we live there, the more important that part becomes, I think, to the way we work. Of course, the detail of how these parts and pieces come together, this is one of my favorite parts of just sort of figuring out what's the function of it, and then what's the beauty of it, what's the poetry of it, and how do you make those two meet. Chicken Point. The cover of my book, basically, this is that project that was really just a little house with a big window. They said they wanted to open up the house to the view. I took it literally, and opened up the front of the house. Oh, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the whole idea of the house, of course, is this big window that opens up here, but structurally, this center column, which is also the fireplace, holds together all the steel sort of beams that come together. And because we're in northern Idaho, the code is a little more lax on that kind of stuff to put structural steel into a fireplace. So but they were fine with it. They seemed to be cool with it because we had a couple of concessions during the process. And so what we did is we had one of the interns, for the clients, we had one of the interns build, an 18-inch sort of model of what that might look like. And the idea was this is a scrap piece of pipe from the Alaska pipeline. A lot of it came out of Spokane, so we found it in a junkyard. And the idea was to basically take that pipe, cut a big old hole in it, and take the piece that we cut out and slam it back into the hole, basically. So that became our mantle, became our sort of fire smoke shield. And when the intern brought the model into the meeting with the client, we all kind of collectively thought it looked like a great big bong. So to this day, we think this is the world's largest bong. We haven't been challenged on that, but that gives you an idea of the scale. And there it is back here. You can see all the steel kind of comes back to that center point. And in the window itself, a big experiment, big risk on the owner's part to basically, make something which started out as a sketch. Innocently, a little bag of sand, for a counterweight. You can move anything with a counterweight and a lever. But I really was lucky to be working with Phil, and we worked on sort of a device of some kind that their only requirement was that it could move with a child's arm strength, which is like a super cool direction from an owner. It says, okay, we'll do this if you can have one of our kids move the piece. And so work closely with, excuse me, I'm going to back up because this is important. Work closely with Phil here. Phil's just one of those terrific people, willing to take risks and willing to kind of get passionately involved in making something that hadn't been done before. So we did a lot of experimenting in his shop, basically, to make sure that this thing worked. It is the art in the place. They don't have any art on the walls. The intention was that this is like our stair, this is the art in the place. So basically, the sculpture's on the stair, or sculpture's on the wall, and it actually works. This is their 4.5-year-old daughter, Savannah, with a broken foot, and she's moving 6.5 tons of glass and steel. And this gives you just an idea from the outside. That's basically, it's just a big lantern on the lake, basically, and you can see it here moving. Entry sequence, obviously, if you have something like that big on the water side, you want to sort of crescendo to that point. So the whole entry sequence is all about sort of squeezing you down, picking up the proportions of the forest, the mixed stand forest that you're coming through, tall, narrow, windy, And so it's also, again, with a cabin, you can sort of play little games like the most public entry is also on center with the most private part of the house. And so we're sort of playing up that. The entry stairs obviously become the lantern for the entry. They become the screen between the house and the kitchen and the distance. And obviously there's circulation to the upper floor. And then you turn the corner to the big view. And and apparently the house works well enough with the sun that even in the winter, and it gets cold here, it's 22 degrees below zero sometimes. But even when it's in the 30s to the 20s, they'll leave this big window open and just sort of let everything move through the house. They're terrific clients again, and they came to me because of the studio house. They'd seen the studio house. Looking back in, there's the bong, there's a structure, there's the big window open at night. It's a 19-foot entry door to sort of pick up those proportions of the forest. You can see that I was talking about earlier. These little dots right here, just like that, just like the little story about that cabinet. You wind up, something shows up. You didn't expect it. It's actually cooler than what you would have thought. Somebody at the shop that made this 19-foot door thought it was crazy that we would have these seams that weren't attached, so it just went with a spot welder. And he thought it was going to be painted and ground smooth. And in fact, it came back with all these little pimples on the seams. I thought it was terrific. Pure luck. Idea of a sink, maybe as a wink and a nod to the fireplace. You're always trying to figure out these little references that happen in the building, because that actually, I'm sure your professors have talked about second glance architecture that keeps giving back to you the more and more you sort of are there. It's not a one-liner. Actually, architecture, if it's going to be around for 200 years, it better have a long story associated with it. So you're always looking for those opportunities to sort of tell the story. Again, this is obvious reference to the fireplace, and it's obviously fire and water, but it's meant to be sort of subtle, and it's meant to actually work as a sink, so you can put your soap there. It drains to this point. That's where the faucet is. And it's just all stainless steel. Very simple sort of idea. Basically a truncated pipe welded to, stainless steel pipe welded to the bottom of a stainless steel sheet of I think it's half-inch stainless steel plate. Important project for me because I'm getting back into the mountains, which is really a big part of my youth. This is 40 acres on the Methow Valley, North Cascades of Washington. An important place for me because I did a lot of climbing. There's the Methow Valley. Mihal, the owner, bought a ranch, and those are the ranch buildings right down here. It was basically a boarding place for a bunch of horses, and had been totally abused. So his idea was to come back to that landscape, that beautiful landscape, and heal it, basically, with something very small. This is Delta Shelter. And he came to me and he said a lot of architects were not interested in doing this project for him because he said he only wanted 1,000 square feet. And he said, I was raised in Poland, in Gdansk, and my mom raised me and two sisters in 650 square feet. 1,000 square feet would be just fine for a weekend cabin. I jumped at the chance. I mean, to me, this is a dream project, but it was interesting that he actually interviewed a lot of architects, and they were not particularly interested in doing a project this small. And this project has meant a lot to my career. It's, again, like Studio House. It not only meant a lot to me personally, but even from a career standpoint, it was a big deal. Basically, the whole idea of the house is that you can open it or you can close it when you leave it, or if you want to keep the place inside warm. This is a very cold area. And here's the diagram, basically. It's a square box. Lower floor is, it's in a floodplain, so the lowest floor is just storage. Middle floor is bedrooms. Top floor is kitchen, dining, and living room. And then basically the four sides can close at the same time using a little hand crank. It kind of works. I mean, it's actually, this one is actually pretty tough to move, and it has to do with some frictional sort of additional forces that we didn't anticipate. Tried to do it as prefab as possible. It kind of worked. SIPS panels. Steel obviously is sort of naturally prefabbed. We just didn't want to, the horses had already beat up the ranch. We just wanted to keep the construction activity relatively light. I'd say it was like a 50% success. There was still, I think, a little too much activity on the site. There you can see the doors kind of closing. That's it in place. it's a tree house, basically, for him. 1,000 square feet seems to work. In many ways, you know, this building, I think, is more important than this building, and that's intentional, that it just sort of disappears into the landscape. Because, in fact, this landscape is the best thing of all there. This is where the rolling huts are located. So he has a bunch of friends, and then he was thinking maybe I could do sort of a commercial investment on the property. I can invite maybe some people to just use like little Thoreau cabins, just 200 square feet, places for no bathroom really, except in the barn, no heat really, except for a fireplace. And we discovered that the local code authorities wouldn't allow us to put anything like that on the site because it was a dwelling. Even though it was 200 square feet, they said, no, that's a dwelling, it's got a bedroom. It didn't have a kitchen, but it had a bedroom. So what we discovered underneath the property was that he had permission from the previous owner to park 14 RVs on the site. So what we did with the cabins is we put them on wheels, and they move, they actually do move, and a little bit, I wouldn't move them too far, but, and we discovered it, the code also said that if a mobile home, if the building is on wheels, it doesn't need a building permit. So we just went ahead and started building these things, got the code authorities all worked up and kind of disappointed in how we approached it. They're changing the law as we speak, or the ordinance as we speak. But it is, you know, when you're in your career, you're going to have to figure out all sorts of ways to sort of work, and in the spirit of the law. I mean, you don't want to break the law to break the law. That's not the point at all. But it was pretty clearly strict, sort of unfortunate adherence to the local code, and we tried to find a way around it. And there were some people in the city that thought, or the county, thought it was funnier than heck, and others that didn't think it was that funny. A pool house, you know, this is a pretty major project for me because we moved actually 90 feet of, this is like taking an idea there we go, taking an idea at Chicken Point and making it big. So basically this is 90 feet of glass, but 90 by 30 feet of glass and steel, and it basically is moved up by hydraulics. And, you know, kind of interesting, but for me, hydraulics, motors, not as interesting if you can't use, you know, the performance and the geometry and the strength of arms. This is a site down in Santa Barbara, Montecito. This is where all those fires were. The fact the fire was on one of the big fires this last spring was over on this ridge here. So this is not a question if, it's a question when the fire comes through here. This was a totally destroyed site for about an 18,000 square foot home that somebody wanted to build. The people that hired me wanted about 3,000 square feet, and to basically heal this site too. Incredible site. But you can see basically the chaparral is just ready to light on fire here. The winds come up here, fires will start down in the city and then just come roaring up through the site. And you can see, I mean, it's just anybody that's in fire fighting can recognize that this can't be a good place. But you can see the site as it was given to us, kind of destroyed. They took the top off, they sort of destroyed all the vegetation. So the idea was to put a very light house on the site, but that would harness as much as, it's not off the grid, it actually has air conditioning in it, but to harness as much as we can off the site and have a relatively light touch on the site. So you can see the entry sequence to the living box that faces to the view to the right here, garage and back with the connection back to the kitchen, and then a little guest pod in part of that entry sequence. To take advantage of that long hallway, the idea was to pick up prevailing breezes from both ends and to exhaust them out what we call the world's tallest Dutch door, so you can keep the top open but keep the bottom locked. So at night they can use the air conditioning as little as possible. Roof obviously collects water to a cistern, basically get evaporative cooling off of the pool back into the building. There are some garage doors with mesh screen in them that we can drop for sun control, not only the roof overhang, but also the garage doors. And also those garage doors, and we didn't know this was going to happen, actually controls the wind so that when the prevailing breezes get a little tough, they drop these, and then they can open their interior windows and have sort of fresh air, but without the stiff winds that come into the house. And obviously the building is, you know, the fire guy here is an indicator that the building has obviously got to be fire resistant. Not fireproof probably, but fire resistant. You can see how the building form is sort of shaped. West side here for the sun, east side to let the sun kind of come into the building. Obviously, the very simple studies on how the sun would affect that roof, but you can kind of give an idea of the form of the building and how it works, catching breezes, evacuating breezes, protecting the house. This is it on the site. From below, from the side, the pool, all out of steel, basically just mild steel. This is not core 10. That's the entry sequence. You can see the Dutch door opening right there, and then the entry sequence all the way down to the box, so that you basically you don't know what you're getting to until you get to the box, and then boom, you're on the edge of the bluff. On the interior, I had nothing to do with this lock. It's like a Mensa test. When you come up here and try to figure your way in and out of this house, it's actually pretty complicated. Phil did it. It's wonderful. Basically, it opens, closes different parts of the building and locks, or different parts of the door and sort of locks them in different ways. I just want to back up here. It's just beautiful. I mean, this is just, you sit back and go, well, okay, that's pretty much perfect. It was just a wonderful thing. And you can kind of see how it works from the inside. And they do use it. And it does limit their air conditioning use. That's it up from below, looking up, of course, at night. Unfortunately, they have to put a lawn around it for the fire, but ideally it would have just been just some grasses. But local code, you have to put lawn in. Just call that Montecito house. I've been working on this house for 10 years, just recently finished in Sun Valley, Idaho, south of Sun Valley, out in the BLM land. You can see this is harsh land, this is high desert. The owner is just terrific, Jan Cox. She's living out in the middle of nowhere. She's a very courageous person. She's also an artist. She loves the seasons, like I love the seasons. But the house has to be this sort of little protective cocoon in this wild landscape. She wants a garden. Obviously, there's a lot of things conspiring to eliminate any sort of garden, from rabbits to antelope to wind to snow, anything to cold, very cold winters. So there's an inner garden. It's a classic paradise garden scheme, walled garden, where she has her fruit trees, her vegetable garden, her cutting garden, roses, the entry sequence into the house, basically, which is just this very simple box out in this very large landscape. So this is about the landscape. I'm going to go through these slides really quickly because this is the building coming out of the ground. But I want you to see, this is an artist. So this is an artist that wants to live on the land rather than in the architecture, which I think is terrific. But you can see, as we're going through these slides, you can see what happens out in that sky over time. And this is just one season, maybe 2 or 3 months, but it's just basically a light show that's happening out beyond. So for an artist, for somebody that's just so visually cued into their environment, their place, their landscape, this is what this house was all about. And you can see the Paradise Garden kind of emerging out in that distance. And that's what it's all about. And of course, there's from the opposite side, looking up towards the BLM land, coming out of the ground. You see the Paradise Garden here, it's protected from the wind and the elements, and then her house, her studio up above in the Four Seasons. Just finished, maybe about 6 months ago. Finished in the inside. The whole idea was tough on the outside, soft on the inside, like a Tootsie Pop. Soft on the inside, I guess. I just came back from this spring, a really exciting project. This is the skiers in the audience may recognize this. This is Valdez. It's an extreme skiing area where basically helicopters take you to these ridges and then you basically shoot down some of these slopes over here. Not this slope over here, but growing up skiing, this has been a dream of mine for years to ski someplace like this, to do architecture is I pinch myself. But basically the site, and this is just from last spring, the site's right here. It's down along the Copper River. Those of you that have had Copper River salmon, that's where it's from, right here. The mountains are right above. That's a roadhouse along the road down to Valdez, and it's about 50 miles outside of Valdez, so basically you're out in the middle of nowhere. That's Billy Mitchell behind you, Forked In, Lonesome, a whole bunch of areas up there. Super exciting terrain to ski. It's like a dream, again, it's like a dream come true for me. This is this spring when 3 of us were up there, 4 of us were up there skiing with Theo, the guide. But it gives you kind of an idea of what they're looking for. They're looking for a place for people to stay that's actually somewhat commodious. So the helicopter can land on top of the building. There's a bunch of rooms here, single rooms, so each with their own bath, kind of a congregation room here, and then kind of a room for maybe a family with kids off to the side. And all directions are very clearly, the geometry of this building comes from views to very important views off in the distance. And Billy Mitchell is part of it, Lonesome is another part, and then a very important part, those of you that know Coombs, who was one of the main pioneers of skiing in here, there's a mountain called Three Pigs right now, but it will also ultimately be called Coomba in memory of Doug Coombs. So you can see the helicopter can land on top, people can come down into the building, and it's above the floodplain. This is along the Stewart River, so basically it floods through here. We know it's going to flood through here. Lots of bears, so the whole idea is to keep everything up above, keep you out of the bears in the water, and then that's a view back towards Billy Mitchell. Project that's just finishing. So these are just a few projects. I'm just going to go quickly through these that are just finishing, not professional, but kind of give you an idea. This is my best client, Carol Bobo, who came back to hire me for her second house. And this is a project in the San Juan Islands, and we're just tucking her little shack basically back here along this incredible piece of property. And this is from the air. The main house, everybody congregates here. The bathhouse, that roof moves. You will see that in a moment. And then sort of like a little guest wing. So it's almost like a T-shirt and plan. And that's the whole idea. You can see it's sort of tucked in. It's intentionally small. You can see some of the other awful buildings that have been built on that point. Shaped by the wind, you can see the roof basically is just picking up those sort of constant winds. You can see the constant sort of working that's happening on those trees. That's the whole idea. Inside, we're going to have movable beds. The beds can go out into the deck, or they can go back in, depending on where you want to move it. If you're spending a night with Carol, this is just some mock-ups on site. This is some of the drawings, just some experiments on how to open that bath roof. We tried all 3. We ultimately decided on this one right down here. Just some of the construction details as we're coming out of the ground. There's the bath roof in the up position. There it is in the up position again. Again, apologies for the photographs. These are just recent construction photographs. There's the device that opens it up. So basically you can sit in the tub, take a shower, and if you're finished, you just drop the roof. And there it is just last week. In the open position, kind of gives you a better idea of what that room is like. Basically, opened it to the garden and the view off to the Olympics off in the distance. That's the owner, Carol, right there, and you can kind of see. Left the trees obviously out in front for privacy. This is where Carol actually indulged me. We actually put the building on a particular part of the site, and the local building design committee told us we pushed it too close to the edge of the cliff. Ridiculous. It was about 7 feet too close to the cliff. Carol said, I don't want to move it. I said, the only way we're going to be able to move it is if we actually can move the deck. And so that's what we're doing. So when the committee shows up, we actually just put the deck away. Whoops, sorry about that. And when they leave, the deck kind of can come back out. Just some shots. It also can be closed off, similar to Delta Shelter. And again, in some subsequent photographs, you can see that this whole building kind of opens up like a big flower to the view and to the landscape. Totally different kind of house, but also on Lopez Island. This is for Merrill Wright. This is her house in basically a rock, a great big rock. And we're basically carving this building into this rock, and we're using the rock for the concrete, the flooring, and then a carport, which you'll see in a second. But basically, rather than building in the meadow and the fertile part of the site, we're basically going into a big old rock, cutting it out, kind of inserting a building into it. You're seeing where the powder room is located right back here. The powder room is actually like a little cave in the rock. These are just some photographs of its current state, probably about a year away from finishing. You can kind of see we left rocks as hearths on the inside, hearth on the outside. Actually left one piece that turned out to be marble. We just lucked out for her, a big chunk is for her master basin. So we'll be sort of carving a basin out of that. This is a quick sketch of what we did with some of the rocks from the project. We basically are making this great big sort of Flintstonian carport. Yeah, it's not in this photograph. There you go. So basically this is the carport. We're building a bunch of structures on the site that aren't enclosed, obviously, but using the rocks that we blasted out of the project. Important project for me, Sun Valley Center for the Arts. Town center for the city, an arts place, basically a Kunsthalle. If you've ever been to Sun Valley or Ketchum, you'll realize they need a center. It's sort of a sad case of a town looking for a center. This could be it. It's in the middle of fundraising right now, which of course is a difficult time, but the whole idea is that basically it's a building that can open and close the interior space to the sun, to the place, to the town. It's intentionally transparent so that when people come to the post office, they are always looking into what's happening on the inside of that building. Again, typical detailing of some of the parts. These are the shutters. We experimented with this in the office. Can we go out and find scrap wood and actually make shutters out of it? So we're actually not even sort of paying for the wood. We're actually able to get it from a lumber mill. These are just scraps. They're beautiful scraps. Oops, I want to back up a second because I thought I had one more. But you can see that the live edge, on sort of the imperfection that comes out of, rather than a perfect sort of shutter, have this sort of take advantage of that live edge. I don't know when this is going to start construction. Hopefully it's starting construction this spring, this coming spring. I doubt it, but we'll see how the fundraising effort goes. Urban infill projects, this is a lot of people don't understand that what's happening in my career is I'm doing a lot more sort of urban infill projects. I'm super excited about this stuff because the context here is the urban fabric, which of course is a terrific fabric. You know, very difficult site to build on. This is a very interesting owner because this is an owner that didn't want high-end condominiums. She wanted condominiums that were affordable to the people that would use the street down below. So for her, she didn't want this to be a second home. She wanted to sell it to people that would live in it 360 days a year, and actually use the street. She's kind of really terrific. Not only the price point's relatively low for construction costs in Seattle, but also she's paying teachers, nurses, or anybody in the medical sort of support services, and teachers. I forgot. There was 2 or 3 groups. She's paying their dues for 3 years in the condominium. The idea was that as she sold the condominiums, that we would paint that color, one of 3 colors, depending on what the owner wanted to pick. And so it becomes this sort of like, instead of having a building that's all one color, it's a building that was sort of chosen by the individual owners inside the building. And that didn't work out because of the economy, obviously. We didn't pre-sell, but they are selling now. But we went through sort of an effort to make it as arbitrary. I had no control over where these colors landed on this building. We sort of set it up in the office so people picked their favorite color without knowing what the other color was next door. So all of these colors are basically random, just finishing really crude photographs that we have right now, but kind of gives you an idea of sort of letting the building sort of happen, and sort of letting go of the sort of tightness, the tight rein that a lot of architects will try to do. So super exciting project because the budget is low. Another project, higher end, certainly. These are, we call it art stable. Basically, it's 4,000-foot plates for artists that have their studio in back and their living space in front. The back side is these great big barn doors so they can bring in sculptures and large pieces off of basically a davit. And then the front side, of course, is going to be just views off to the west. And fortunately, we have a north face that's open so we can use north light into the studio space. So you can see sort of the big studio wall windows here, that big sort of, east-facing glass, but also these big doors that open up, the davit that can grab big, heavy stuff, and then the view side, the living side of the house, which is that side right there. And that's the living side. It should start construction in a couple of months. And there you go. There's the back side. That's the studio side. That's the big north wall for the studio. And then there's the living side. And finally, Just a couple more projects. This is an interesting project. Those of you who know Seattle may recognize that corner, First and Stewart. This is the Pike Place Market. Nothing's ever been built on that corner. One of the most important properties in the city. When you go up First Avenue, that corner has always been empty, and we've been asked by the owners to do a building. So clearly, we want to make some sort of icon in the corner and a very simple courtyard building, because courtyard is a tradition in Seattle more than you might think, even though we don't have that much sun. So basically the interior is all about coming into a place like the market. The market works with sort of interior spaces and then trying to grab all four corners, urban corners. There's the sort of the pile of buildings that become kind of a lantern on the street, and then the rest of that's a hotel, and then the rest of the building is residential, apartments. Kind of gives you an idea how picking up the geometry of this building picks up the shifted geometry of the streets. That's First Avenue, that's Stewart right there. And at night, it becomes like a stack of lanterns. Entry sequence back into the courtyards. New York City, Chelsea, super exciting project, probably will never see the light of day. But the idea of this building was that it basically is just big scramble of open and close, that basically everybody kind of controls their building from down below. It's in where the I-beam building is. And finally, a project in Anacortes. I wanted to sort of end on a project that most people would probably not find particularly interesting, but I actually find it totally interesting. These are the people that make the towers for wind machines. So not the blades, but the towers themselves. So super interesting fabrication process, and that's the scale of those tubes that they're building. So clearly, when you see something like that, you want to make something out of this. So the whole idea of the building is, in fact, this is the existing building itself. This is the idea of the building. And basically, we use a big old tube for the stair and the ventilation and the skylight, and that's the vertical tube. So it also becomes kind of a billboard for what they do. And then we use a horizontal tube for the structure that holds up this building as it kind of comes off the existing. So, that's even clearer. As it comes off the existing building, this building basically is picked up by one of their big tubes. They can roll 2-inch thick steel plate, 14 feet in diameter by 10 feet long. It's just incredible to watch what they can do with these things. So I'm just going to end on this image because I think it speaks about what's important to me as an architect, is everything from doing the furniture and sometimes being indulged for very tall, important buildings in urban centers. And boy, the spectrum between those two, there's some of the most exciting things you can possibly imagine. So I think for the students in particular, you're going to be super frustrated. That's one last word of advice. People always ask me, what do you advise students as they're going into the profession of architecture? It's patience. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It doesn't come easy. But if you really do learn how to harvest all those things that you grew up that are personal, that are idiosyncratic to you, no one can design anything like that because it's coming from a very personal place. Don't look at magazines or books too hard for ideas, for your ideas, because in fact, those are somebody else's ideas, if that makes any sense. And in fact, those ideas, if you're thinking about those ideas as being current, they're 4 years old. If you look at my book, you look at some of the projects in my book, some of them are 12 years old. They're very important to me, they're relevant to me and my clients because they were there at that time. And that's what I would recommend to you all, is be patient, the good client will come along, and be really careful about how you sort of harvest what's really personal and near and dear. Architecture, it couldn't be a better profession for that. Thanks.